There's a story that you didn't do Godfather 3
Yeah.
because they didn't offer you enough money.
Yeah, well, it was a matter of some money. You know, it became money, and yeah, it was a matter of principle.
On February 15th, 2026, the last man who truly knew what happened inside the greatest movie ever made died peacefully at his Virginia home at 95 years old.
One of these guys, because I've never seen it on film, and never have since, except maybe in documentaries.
Before Robert Duvall left this world, he had already confirmed secrets about The Godfather that Hollywood had quietly buried for over 50 years. Secrets about Marlon Brando, a 5-to-1 pay betrayal, and a Godfather film so powerful it was never allowed to exist. Most people know the movie. Almost nobody knows the full story behind it. This is that story. The story that just broke. Let us start with what just happened, because this is not ancient history. This broke weeks ago, and the full picture is still being assembled. Robert Duvall passed away on February 15th, 2026, at his home in Middleburg, Virginia. His wife, Luciana, was holding his hand. In the hours that followed, the tributes came from every direction. Al Pacino called him a born actor whose phenomenal gift would always be remembered. Robert De Niro said simply, "God bless Bobby. I hope I can live till I'm 95. Francis Ford Coppola posted on Instagram, and what he wrote was telling. He did not write broadly about Duvall's talent or legacy. He listed 5 films by name: The Rain People, The Conversation, The Godfather, The Godfather Part 2, Apocalypse Now. 5 films made together in 10 years. Then silence between the two men for 46 more years after that. Coppola named every film in their collaboration, and in doing so, quietly acknowledged the wound that never healed. What is worth sitting with, before moving any further, is what that silence actually represents. 46 years is not a cooling-off period. 46 years is a decision, renewed every single year, by 2 men who had made something together that neither of them would ever fully surpass. The silence was not hostility in any simple sense. It was the particular kind of distance that only forms between people who were once close enough that the falling apart still hurts decades later. Coppola did not stop admiring Duvall. Duvall never stopped respecting what they had built together. But something broke in the machinery of their relationship after Part 3, and neither man found a way to fix it publicly, which means it likely was never fixed privately either. That Instagram post, listing 5 films and stopping, was as close to an apology as the film industry ever produces. It was also, notably, too late. But one statement made after Duvall's death has not received the attention it deserves, and it changes the way you watch The Godfather from the very first frame. Peter Bart, senior executive at Paramount Pictures during the actual production in 1971 and 72, confirmed something that had circulated among Hollywood insiders for decades, but had never been stated so plainly by someone with direct knowledge. Bart said Duvall was by far the closest person to Marlon Brando on that set. He said Duvall would often calm Brando down when Brando became agitated by a script change or a demanded reshoot. And then Bart said something that stops you cold. He said it was almost as if Duvall was Brando's consigliere and his link to Coppola. The man playing Tom Hagen, the fictional consigliere of the Corleone crime family, was functioning in real life as the actual consigliere of the most volatile and powerful actor in Hollywood history, quietly keeping a production together that the studio was actively watching for any excuse to derail. The character and the man had collapsed into each other with a precision no casting director could have manufactured deliberately. What makes Bart's confirmation so significant is not just what it reveals about Duvall. It reveals something about the specific kind of intelligence Duvall possessed that the industry consistently undervalued and almost never publicly named. There is a category of person on every great set, not the loudest, not the most decorated, not the one whose name appears first, whose primary function is situational reading. They understand, before anyone has said anything, when a room is about to go wrong. They know which ego needs managing, which silence signals danger, which argument will cost 2 days of shooting if it is allowed to develop past a certain point. Duvall had this quality in abundance, and he deployed it entirely without fanfare, which is exactly what makes it so difficult to credit after the fact. The people who keep things from falling apart rarely appear in any official account of how things stayed together. Duvall spent the last decade of his life releasing these secrets in carefully controlled installments. An interview here, a confirmation there, a detail in a 50th anniversary retrospective. He never gave everything at once. He told the truth on his own schedule, in his own time, making sure to leave nothing essential unsaid before he was gone. Now that he is gone, every piece can finally be placed in its position. What happened on that set is not merely backstory to a great film. It is the actual story of how greatness is built, how it is almost destroyed, and how one man standing slightly behind the action can hold the entire thing together without anyone acknowledging it while he is alive to receive that credit. And it begins with Marlon Brando knocking on a hotel room door, and what happened inside that room saved the entire production before a single camera ever opened. The morning the greatest actor alive knocked on his door. What actually happened between these two men began not on a film set, but in a hotel corridor, before a single frame had been photographed, when Brando appeared at Duvall's door without warning, carrying deli sandwiches and a bottle of red wine. No studio arrangement, no publicist. The most scrutinized actor in Hollywood had simply decided he wanted to spend a morning with his co-star and showed up. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what Brando represented in 1971. His commercial value had been declining for nearly a decade. Studio head Robert Evans viewed him as a financial liability, and Coppola had to fight hard and repeatedly just to keep him in the project. And yet this man, with everything to prove, took it upon himself to build a human relationship with his co-star before the work began. When Duvall talked about that hotel room across decades of interviews, he consistently came back to one word: equal. He never felt intimidated. An English actor had once traveled to New York specifically to see Brando in a streetcar named Desire, and was so completely dismantled that he initially thought a stagehand had wandered on stage by mistake. And yet Duvall, trained by Sanford Meisner in the discipline of truthful responsiveness, never felt outmatched. They were working at the same frequency. Duvall had arrived in New York in 1955 on the GI Bill with no Hollywood connections and no family money, sorting mail, clerking at Macy's, sharing an apartment with a young unknown named Dustin Hoffman, and sitting at Cromwell's drugstore weekly with Gene Hackman and James Caan, talking about acting over coffee they could barely afford. What all three were learning at the neighborhood playhouse under Meisner was simple in principle and difficult in practice. Respond to what is actually in front of you. Listen first, perform second. The camera always found Duvall because he was always genuinely there. Brando recognized that quality instantly, and two completely different philosophies of acting produced something rarer than either approach could have generated alone. Duvall's assessment of Brando captured this in a contradiction only someone who genuinely loved the man could hold. He called Brando innately shrewd, with an ability to find ways to do things better than everyone else, and in the same breath called it one of the great tragedies that Brando never fully developed his tremendous potential. That is not a slight. That is a eulogy, admiration and mourning, held simultaneously, without contradiction. What Duvall kept close to his chest for years was not the friendship nor the admiration. It was a secret about how Brando actually operated on camera, so strange and so completely at odds with the myth of the greatest actor alive that when Duvall finally confirmed it openly, Hollywood spent days not knowing whether to laugh or be stunned. The secret that was literally taped to Duvall's chest. The greatest screen actor of the 20th century could not remember his lines, and Robert Duvall, standing in the frame of some of the most celebrated scenes in American cinema, was holding those lines on his own body so that Brando could read them while appearing to look at his scene partner. Duvall confirmed this himself on Late Night with Seth Meyers in 2015, with the easy candor of a man who had made peace with the absurdity of it decades ago. In the famous garden scene between the Don and Michael, one of the most emotionally precise exchanges in American film history, Brando's dialogue was written on a card taped to the bark of a tree, just above his eye line. He glanced at the tree. He delivered the lines people have been quoting for 50 years. He looked back at Pacino. Duvall offered the most charitable interpretation possible, which is that Brando believed fully memorized dialogue was the enemy of genuine spontaneity. By keeping lines on cards in his sight lines, he could approach each take as if the words were arriving for the first time, rather than being retrieved from a memorized store. He was, in a twisted and almost brilliant way, applying a version of the very principle Meisner had taught Duvall: live in the moment, let the words arrive freshly. The problem is that everyone else on that set had memorized their lines, while Brando was reading off furniture and occasionally off his co-star's torso. There is photographic evidence and direct confirmation from Duvall that on at least one occasion, Brando's lines were taped to Duvall's own chest so that Brando could read them while looking at him in the scene. Tom Hagen, standing in frame, serving as a human teleprompter for the Don. The metaphor writes itself, and it is both funnier and more poignant than anything the screenplay contains. The cast did not passively accept this arrangement. They turned it into sport. When Brando was not looking, they would swap out his cue cards for completely different material. On at least one confirmed occasion, they replaced his script pages with a wedding invitation. The camera rolled. Brando looked at his card. His lines were gone. Someone had to cut. And Coppola, managing a production that Paramount was watching for any sign of instability, put his head in his hands. Duvall confirmed the primary architect of these pranks was James Caan. And here is the detail that makes the whole picture feel different from the reverential mythology surrounding the film. Brando loved it. He would hear a joke and then, after a full 3 seconds of delay, begin to laugh. 3 seconds. The most legendary actor in American cinema needed 3 full seconds to process a punchline from Jimmy Caan. And then the laughter would arrive, real and warm. And the lived-in familiarity that runs through every frame of The Godfather was not engineered in post-production. It was produced between takes, over pranks, over wedding invitations slipped under cue cards, over wine carried in a grocery bag to a hotel room. And then there was the mooning. Between takes, Brando would simply drop his trousers, not randomly or cruelly, but deliberately and with comedic intention. It was his way of saying, "We're actors. Don't take this too seriously," Duvall explained. The Don of all Dons, the man who delivered the offer they cannot refuse line into the permanent canon of the American language, was keeping his cast loose by showing them his backside between the most important takes of his career. When production moved to Apocalypse Now in 1979, jungle conditions made cue cards impractical. So Brando adapted. Coppola fed him lines through an electronic earpiece. The most celebrated improviser in cinema history spent two of the most legendary films ever made operating on prompt. Duvall's assessment of Brando's cue card habit, offered in the 50th anniversary retrospective, was this: "I think it was partially that, and partially laziness. He did not dress it up. He said the plain thing because the plain thing was true." What Brando's cue cards and the pranks and the mooning were actually producing, without anyone planning it, was the most important element of the entire film. And the way Coppola engineered that element through a single dinner in Manhattan changes how you understand every scene in The Godfather from the beginning. The dinner table where the Corleone family became real. Francis Ford Coppola understood something in 1971 that most directors never fully grasp. You cannot manufacture a family in an editing room. You cannot write family chemistry into a screenplay. You have to build it before the cameras open. Before a single scene was shot, Coppola organized a formal dinner for the principal cast on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Not a table read, not a production meeting, a dinner in character, with Brando at the head of the table. Duvall described the effect with the clarity that only comes from having truly lived something. He said it was like a real family. All of these young actors had a lot of respect for Brando, and Coppola choreographed that deliberately. The seating was not casual. Coppola placed every actor exactly where their character would have sat in a real Corleone gathering. Brando at the head, because the Don always sits at the head. Cayenne positioned close to the father, because Sonny is always close to the father's heat. Pacino placed slightly apart, always watching rather than leading. Duvall seated slightly off-center, slightly behind the primary action, present at everything, dominant in nothing, exactly where Tom Hagen has always lived in every scene. Duvall said that specific position gave him the entire psychology of his character before he had spoken a word of dialogue in rehearsal. As an adopted son, he explained, you cannot step over a certain line. That quality did not come from the script. It came from a dinner where a director told a group of actors where to sit and trusted the rest to happen naturally. The film was produced on a budget of $6 million and grossed $250 million worldwide, roughly $1.5 billion in current money. It won 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. Paramount had opposed every significant casting decision Coppola made, and he fought for every element the studio wanted to change or remove. What came out of that battle was a film the National Film Registry selected for permanent preservation. Robert Duvall received his first Academy Award nomination for his performance. Over the next 2 decades, he would collect 6 more. What nobody in that dining room in Manhattan could have predicted was that the family Coppola had so carefully built would be torn apart 18 years later, not by anything dramatic or violent, but by a number on a piece of paper and a decision about what one man's dignity was worth. The number that ended everything. By 1989, Coppola had publicly said he was finished with the Corleone saga. What changed his mind was not creative inspiration. His production company Zoetrope had been financially destroyed by the catastrophic failure of his 1982 musical fantasy, One from the Heart. Paramount came to him not with an artistic vision, but with a financial rescue. And Coppola accepted because he needed the money to survive. Al Pacino was offered $5 million to return as Michael Corleone. Robert Duvall was offered $1 million to return as Tom Hagen, 5-1. In the 15 years since Part 2, Both men had continued building careers of extraordinary distinction. Pacino had become one of the defining faces of American cinema. Duvall had won the Academy Award for Best Actor for Tender Mercies in 1983, a performance so far from Tom Hagen in every conceivable dimension that the range between the two roles is almost impossible to fully process. He sang his own vocals in that film. He played a broken and spiritually dislocated country music star. He had the highest individual honor the film industry offers, and Paramount came back to him at a ratio of 5-1. Duvall's position, stated with remarkable consistency across more than 20 years of interviews, was precise and clear. He was not asking for equal pay. He understood that Pacino as lead of the film would earn more. What he could not accept was the specific ratio. He told Charlie Rose in 2004 that if Paramount had paid Pacino twice what they paid him, he would have called that fair. They did not pay Pacino twice what they offered Duvall. They paid him 5 times. The mathematics make this decision difficult to explain in any terms other than a deliberate statement about value. Duvall has said publicly he would have accepted roughly half of whatever Pacino received. The gap between what was offered and what he would have accepted to return was approximately $1.5 million. The total reported production budget for Part 3 was $54 million. $1.5 million represents less than 3% of that total. Someone at Paramount looked at those numbers, understood that closing that gap would bring back the character who held the entire emotional architecture of the trilogy together, and decided it was not worth doing. What followed is one of the most humanly strange moments in the entire saga. Coppola drove personally to Duvall's farm in Middleburg, Virginia, to make his case, to smooth things over, to find a path through the impasse. What Duvall remembered about that visit, with the unforgiving precision of a man who could not quite make himself forget it, was the kitchen. He told the story on 60 Minutes too, and in subsequent interviews with the same deadpan delivery. Coppola came to the farm, came into the kitchen. Duvall, knowing Coppola had always wanted his crab cake recipe, cooked it for him, because Coppola loves to eat, and because Duvall is the kind of man who feeds people. Coppola wrote the recipe down on paper, left the farm, forgot the paper, called back twice to ask for the recipe again. The director of the greatest American film ever made had driven to his actor's Virginia farm to negotiate a return to the most important franchise of either man's career, and the detail he pursued with the most urgency was a crab cake recipe. When Reuters later asked Duvall whether he regretted walking away, his response was as clean and economical as Tom Hagen ending a meeting. He said no, and then he said, because it was not as good as the other two. Because the film Coppola actually made is not the film he originally planned to make. A dramatically superior version exists that audiences never got to see, and its absence created a hole in the trilogy that no amount of additional filming has ever filled. The Godfather film that Hollywood buried. There is a film that Francis Ford Coppola planned in precise detail and never got to make. Not because the screenplay did not exist, and not because the vision was unclear, but because a single arithmetic decision at Paramount erased the dramatic architecture that 18 years of storytelling had been quietly constructing. Coppola has described across multiple interviews and DVD commentary what the original structural concept for Part 3 looked like with Tom Hagen at its center. The film was never conceived as a Michael Corleone solo story. It was conceived as a split narrative, with Michael and Hagen as its two co-leads. The seeds of that split had been planted deliberately across the first two films. Every sideways glance between Pacino and Duvall, when Michael makes a decision Hagen disagrees with, Every moment where the counselor holds his tongue rather than cross the line his position requires. Every restrained, quietly devastating disagreement between these two men across 4 hours of cinema was building toward a confrontation that Part 3 was supposed to finally deliver. In the film that was planned and never made, Tom Hagen would have been managing the Corleone family's charitable foundations and legitimate enterprises. The dramatic spine of the film would have been Hagen navigating that legitimacy while Michael remained permanently compromised by everything he had done to get there. Two men who grew up at the same table diverging at the moment of greatest consequence. The consigliere finally more legitimate than the Don. That is the film the audience had earned after 18 years. That is the reckoning that every scene between Duvall and Pacino had been quietly promising. What makes this loss specifically painful is that it was not a creative failure. Coppola knew exactly what the third film needed to be. The thematic logic was already complete. The entire moral weight of the trilogy was pointing toward one destination: the moment where Tom Hagen, the man who had absorbed every compromise and swallowed every objection for 2 full films, finally stood on higher ground than the man he had served. That inversion, the adopted outsider becoming more legitimate than the Blood Don, was the only ending that could have given the trilogy the closure it had structurally promised. It did not require new ideas. It required the one actor whose presence would have made it land. And that actor was available, willing in principle, and separated from the production by less than 3% of its total budget. Instead, Tom Hagen's absence is explained in a single line of dialogue. He had died of illness sometime between the second and third films. No confrontation. No final scene between these two men. No moment where Hagen looks at Michael and says what the audience has been feeling since the baptism sequence. Just a line, spoken by a minor character. In passing, a lawyer named B.J. Harrison, played by George Hamilton, was written to fill the functional role Hagen had occupied. He could not do what Tom Hagen did. He had none of the history, none of the moral authority, none of the standing that comes from 40 years of shared experience. Without Hagen, Michael Corleone had nobody to answer to, nobody to deliver the confrontation the trilogy had been building toward for 18 years. The emotional culmination of the entire Corleone saga became a line of expository dialogue about a man who was already dead. There is something almost clinical about how completely the film collapses without that one relationship at its center. It is not merely that Michael feels lonely or that the ensemble feels thinner. It is that Michael Corleone, without Tom Hagen, has no moral mirror. Every scene in the first 2 films where Michael makes a decision that costs him something human, there is Hagen in the frame, registering it, absorbing it, saying nothing because saying something would cost him his position. Remove that witness, and Michael's decline becomes purely operational. A man losing power. Without Hagen, you lose the recording of what that power cost him. And that recording was the entire point. Coppola acknowledged what was lost. He said, in a moment of uncharacteristic directness, that the film feels incomplete without Duvall's participation. There is one final and genuinely surreal footnote. In 2006 and 2009, Robert Duvall returned to the role of Tom Hagen, not in a film, but in video game adaptations of The Godfather, where the character was given a more central presence than the films themselves had provided. The man who walked away from Part 3 on principle voiced a character in the interactive sequel, because he was not finished with Tom Hagen, and Tom Hagen was not finished with him. The pay dispute and the missing film are not the whole story of what was lost. What Peter Bart confirmed after Duvall's death points toward something much larger. a role Duvall had been playing behind the camera on every film they made together that nobody ever publicly acknowledged. The man who held the whole thing together. Peter Bart's statement after Duvall's death is not a warm tribute offered out of politeness. It is a factual confirmation of something the film industry quietly relies on but almost never names. That every great production has one person whose job is to absorb what nobody else can carry. On The Godfather, that person was never listed in that role. He was listed as an actor. But the job he was actually doing was older and less glamorous than acting. He was keeping human beings functional under pressure, and he was doing it without being asked and without being credited. What followed Duvall after The Godfather was a career of range that should not be possible in a single working life. Apocalypse Now, The Great Santini, Tender Mercies, Lonesome Dove, The Apostle, which he wrote, directed, and starred in himself. In every role he ever played, including the ones that had nothing to do with crime families or Virginia farmland or broken country singers, Duvall carried the same quality that made him irreplaceable on that Manhattan set in 1971. He made the people around him more real, not more dramatic, more real. That is a rarer gift than talent, and it does not show up in any performance metric the industry has ever devised. His wife Luciana's statement after his death said something devastating in its simplicity. To the world, he was an Academy Award-winning actor, a director, a storyteller. To her, he was simply everything. Consistent with his wishes, no formal service was held. His family asked that those who wished to honor his memory do so by watching a great film, telling a good story around a table with friends, or taking a drive through the countryside to appreciate the world's beauty. No eulogies, no ceremony, just the work, just the stories, just the truth. That is a Tom Hagen ending, earned quietly over a lifetime of doing the thing that needed doing, without waiting for anyone to notice. The older the violin, the sweeter the music. That is the complete story of what Robert Duvall confirmed happened behind the cameras of the greatest film ever made, and how one man standing quietly at the edge of every frame held more together than any of us ever fully knew. Tell us in the comments which part of this story you had never heard before.